Greetings, everyone, and thank you for attending this important event. Thank you to the Illinois African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission for having me back to once again speak on this intriguing, disturbing, but again, all-important part of our state's history. Today, I'll be talking to you about Illinois' relationship with the enslavement era. Contrary to popular belief, Illinois was very much involved in enslavement during the enslavement era, or the chattel enslavement era. The commonly held belief is that the South is where, quote unquote, all the slavery was. But slavery certainly existed up north as well. In this talk, I will cover the origin of enslavement in Illinois, some of the laws pertaining to slavery in Illinois, and touch on some of the lasting consequences of this history on African Americans in the state of Illinois. Interestingly, between the Civil War and World War II, 1 out of every 5 African Americans that were lynched outside of a slave state were lynched in Illinois. In Gallatin County, located in southern Illinois, there stands a house formerly owned by John Crenshaw, a slave owner, in the early to mid-1800s. Legend has it that the Crenshaw House, better known as the Old Slave House, held enslaved people captive in cages, among other atrocities. More verifiably, John Crenshaw is guilty of kidnapping and trafficking free black people across state lines to southern slave states. This is known as the Reverse Underground Railroad. This history highlights the deep and disheartening history of Illinois' disturbing relationship with and complicity in slavery. Historical records tell us that the first enslaved Africans were brought to Illinois in 1720 by a Frenchman named Philippe Francois. Slavery and indentured servitude were practiced in Illinois from 1720 all the way to emancipation in 1863/65, if you will, as noted by scholar Tara McAndrew. Stories of enslaved Illinois blacks reveal that they were bought, sold at auction, kidnapped, indentured, punished, controlled, gifted, and treated as property in the land of Lincoln. In the early to mid-1800s, Illinois' Black Code laws mandated that slaves could not venture more than 10 miles from the master's home without permission, gather in groups of 3 or more, engage in commerce without their overseer's permission, be lazy, disorderly, or misbehave. Disobedience was punishable by up to 40 lashes of the whip, and sometimes even jail. These laws stipulated that no black person could settle in the state until they produced a certificate of freedom under the seal of the court. Otherwise, they would be considered a slave. To be clear, Illinois' brand of slavery was just as brutal as the more well-known southern versions of slavery. For example, documents and court orders from the mid to late 1700s show that enslaved African Americans were forced to publicly apologize on their knees to illustrate submissiveness, be whipped for 3 consecutive days, receive 25 or more strokes of the whip in certain instances, have their ears cut off, and their shoulders branded, among other horrific punishments. These punishments were for various indiscretions, such as threatening or assaulting a white person, running away, or even using bad language. These were part of the Code Noir, or Black Codes, originally issued by France. The Illinois Constitution also allowed indentured servitude at the salt mines in southern Illinois. The mines were situated in a town ironically named Equality, Illinois, and provided significant income for the state while serving as an American presence in what the United States government considered vulnerable frontier territory. On July 13th, interesting date, 1787, the United States Congress passed an ordinance, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, to end slavery in the then called Indiana Territory, which consisted of Illinois and Indiana. This sparked years of protest and legal maneuvering by Illinois slave owners and local officials. Local delegates argued at the time that 9 out of 10 Illinois residents supported slavery. Unfortunately, this law was largely ignored and purposely misinterpreted to allow slavery to continue in the state. In 1845, the Illinois Supreme Court retroactively ruled in Jarrett v. Jarrett that the Northwest Ordinance had freed all slaves within the territory. The Supreme Court ruled that the French slaves in Illinois should legally have been free for the past 58 years of their enslavement, but did not even consider any compensation for the time they were illegally held in bondage. On September 17, 1807, the territorial legislature passed a law allowing slave owners to exert power over the enslaved or indentured individuals between 28 and 99 years, depending on various factors regarding their individual classifications. Legislation in 1813 prevented black people from immigrating to the Illinois Territory, and the Madison County Historical Society notes that in December of 1818, this territory officially became known as the state of Illinois. At that time, there were 847 indentured servants, or slaves, 326 free black people, and 29,620 white people living in Illinois. The Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 were federal laws that permitted the capture and return of runaway slaves within the United States territory. As a result of these laws, many free African Americans in Illinois were kidnapped and forced into bondage in other states. Again, this is part of the reverse Underground Railroad. In response, Chicago's African American community formed the Liberation Association, which conducted patrols to prevent the seizure of blacks by slaveholders and their agents. The 1853 black laws passed in Illinois were considered the harshest of all discriminatory laws in the northern states before the Civil War. The bill banned African American immigration, with violators facing fines, imprisonment, or even being sold into slavery. Another noteworthy aspect of Illinois' connection to slavery were the Illinois military vouchers for enslaved persons. Used as promissory notes, the vouchers were issued by the Illinois state government to compensate slave owners when their slaves were enlisted to serve in the Union Army. Illinois contributed soldiers to the Union Army during the Civil War. This was a common practice in other northern states as well. Interestingly, although Illinois had already formally abolished slavery, many slaveholders ignored this law and continued enslaving African Americans. To reconcile this illegal act, the Illinois legislature made it possible for slave owners to be paid for their slaves being utilized by the military, even though it was illegal to have them. Slave owners simply had to appeal to the Illinois government, and they'd receive vouchers or certificates for varying dollar amounts per enslaved person they lost to military service. These vouchers or certificates were as good as cash for the slaveholder. Following emancipation in the Civil War, racial tensions and conflicts persisted in Illinois through the late 1800s and into the mid-1900s, culminating in events like the Springfield Race Riot of 1908. During this riot, approximately 5,000 white people attacked, injured, lynched, killed, and destroyed the property of African Americans, driving thousands out of the city. Author James Loewen notes in his book, Sundown Towns, Hidden Dimensions of Racism, that the Springfield Massacre influenced other communities in Illinois, setting a precedent for excluding blacks from predominantly white neighborhoods between 1890 and 1940. The Springfield Race Riot, interestingly, was one of the catalysts for the formation of the NAACP. Today, the legacy of slavery significantly impacts the lived experience of African Americans in Illinois. Nationwide, following emancipation, African Americans continue to experience racial terror and ineligibility for avenues to upward mobility. This harsh reality in the South led to the Great Migration in the early to mid-1900s, which brought millions of African Americans from the South to northern cities like Chicago, exacerbating racial tensions in the North. One of the most enduring legacies of slavery is the wealth gap between blacks and whites here in Illinois. Wealth inequality negatively impacts every aspect of African Americans' lives, including education, family dynamics, mental health, and social experiences. A consumer finance organization even ranked Illinois as the worst state in the country for financial racial equity. According to a 2019 report by the Housing Action Illinois, Illinois has one of the largest gaps in median income between blacks and whites. In Illinois, black households earn 52 cents for every dollar earned by white households. And the poverty gap between black and white residents is substantial. The University of Illinois Chicago's Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy found that intergenerational transfers of resources are the primary driver of the racial wealth gap in Illinois. The lack of intergenerational wealth among middle-class black and Latino families creates financial instability and exacerbates stress and anxiety, affecting the overall well-being of these groups. It is clear that the state of Illinois' troubled history with the enslavement of African Americans caused great harm to those directly tortured by this reality. But it is also clear that even after emancipation, the residue of this peculiar institution continued to impact the lived experiences, upward mobility, and overall health of black Illinoisans for generations to come. Even today, there is a direct link between slavery, social and legal practices after emancipation, and the gap in wealth between whites and blacks in Illinois and around the country. Thank you all.